White woman kicked out black child from first-class seat. Moments later, pilot's response shocked her. Get out of that seat. You don't belong here, black boy. The words ripped through the silence of the first-class cabin, so loud they felt like a slap to the face. A 13-year-old black boy, traveling alone, sat stunned in his seat, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. His school had chosen him, a brilliant young student, to represent them in an important competition in New York, and this flight was supposed to be the start of his journey. But now, he was face to face with something he never expected. The woman standing in the aisle, her arms crossed, looked down at him with pure disdain. This seat is for people like me, not people like you, she sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of centuries of prejudice, and it felt like the whole cabin was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The boy, alone on this trip, had never felt so vulnerable. He wasn't just a kid flying to a competition. Now, he was a target. He was caught in an ugly situation, one he didn't know how to navigate. He had no parents there to defend him, no one to stand between him and the woman who had decided, without any reason other than the color of his skin, that he didn't belong. His hands gripped the armrests of the first-class seat, and he stared at the woman in confusion. He didn't even understand why she hated him, why she felt entitled to make him feel like less than human. He had worked so hard to get here. He was smart, talented, chosen for his excellence in his studies, a bright young student representing his school. But now, none of that mattered. To this woman, the only thing that mattered was the color of his skin. And in that moment, it didn't matter how hard he'd worked or how far he'd come. He was nothing more than a black boy in her eyes. The flight attendants stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The boy looked up at them, but they offered no help. His heart raced in his chest, and the knot in his stomach tightened. What was supposed to be a routine flight to New York for a bright, promising future was turning into a nightmare. The woman wasn't backing down. You don't belong here, she demanded, her tone cutting like a blade. But then, just as the tension in the cabin reached its peak, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, deep, commanding, and unwavering. I need that woman removed from my flight immediately. The entire cabin went silent. The woman's face drained of color, her mouth falling open in shock. The boy, still in his seat, couldn't believe what he was hearing. He hadn't expected this. He had feared, like so many others before him, that his silence and isolation would be met with more silence. But this was different. The authority of the pilot's voice was powerful. And the woman, for the first time, was the powerless one. Would the woman be removed? Would the boy's bravery and the pilot's intervention be enough to end this unjust confrontation? How would the other passengers react to the shock of seeing a young boy face such an act of prejudice in such a public setting? And what about you? Have you ever faced something like this, being judged or mistreated because of your race? Where were you and how did it feel? We want to hear from you. Share your experience in the comments below. Also, like and share this video, and subscribe to the Hyper Racism channel. Together, we can make sure stories like these get old and stand up against injustice wherever it's found. The boy, Malik Johnson, was someone the passengers didn't know. To them, he was just another face in the crowd, another young passenger seated in first class, minding his business on a flight to New York. But Malik wasn't just any kid. At 13 years old, he was already on the verge of something big, something that could change the trajectory of his life. Malik had been chosen by his school, Preston Academy, an elite institution located in Beverly Hills, California, to represent them in a prestigious national competition. Preston Academy was known for nurturing the most brilliant minds, a school that catered to the children of the wealthiest families, with its vast resources and a reputation for excellence. Malik had earned his spot there, a rare distinction for someone from his background, a young black boy from a working-class neighborhood in Los Angeles. His school recognized his exceptional talent in mathematics and science and ensured he was given the best resources to thrive. This flight was part of the reward for his hard work and brilliance, fully funded by Preston Academy to ensure he had the best chance of representing the school with pride at the competition in New York City. It was a momentous occasion for Malik, who had long dreamed of showing the world just what he could do. This wasn't just any competition. It was a national stage where the brightest minds from across the country would gather. Malik wasn't just competing for a prize. He was competing to prove to everyone, including himself, that he had what it took to make it to the top. As Malik settled into his seat, his heart raced with excitement. This was the moment he had been waiting for. But what should have been an inspiring start to his journey quickly turned into something completely unexpected. The woman standing in the aisle, her expression twisted with anger, pointed at Malik, and her voice rang out, cutting through the quiet cabin. "Get out of that seat, Blackie." Malik's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a slap in the face. He froze, unsure of how to respond. He was just a young boy, alone on this flight, flying to a competition that would define his future. He wasn't prepared for this kind of confrontation. And yet, there it was, racism, raw and unfiltered, hurled at him from a stranger who had no idea who he was or what he was capable of. The woman's words grew harsher, her tone dripping with entitlement. "This seat is for people like me, not people like you," she spat, her gaze cold and disdainful. The insult was loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, and for a moment, everything else seemed to vanish. All eyes turned to the confrontation unfolding in front of them. Malik's hands gripped the armrests, his palms sweaty. He looked around, searching for a glimmer of support, but the passengers around him avoided eye contact, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The flight attendants stood frozen, unsure of how to handle the situation. At that moment, Malik felt more alone than he ever had before. There was no parent to step in, no teacher to defend him, and certainly no one in that cabin who seemed willing to challenge the woman who had decided that he didn't belong in that seat. His mind raced, trying to process the situation. How had it come to this? He had worked so hard for this moment. He had earned his place here. Yet, none of that seemed to matter to the woman, who saw only the color of his skin. And then, just as Malik thought the situation couldn't get any worse, a deep, authoritative voice crackled over the intercom, startling the entire cabin. "I need that woman removed from my flight immediately." The words hung in the air, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. The woman, her face flushed with rage, looked up at the speaker in disbelief. Her entitlement, her sense of superiority, had been shaken in an instant. Would the woman leave? Would the authorities come to escort her off the plane? Or would she defy the pilot's command and escalate the situation further? Malik could barely breathe. His mind was still reeling from the woman's words, from the insult, but now, there was a chance for this injustice to be righted. Yet, nothing was certain. The silence in the cabin seemed to stretch forever as everyone waited for what would happen next. The tension was palpable. Malik's stomach twisted with uncertainty. The woman didn't move, not at first. She stood there, her arms crossed, eyes locked on the flight attendants, daring them to challenge her. She was a woman accustomed to getting her way, accustomed to feeling entitled. The cabin was still, waiting for her next move. Would she comply? Would the authorities remove her, or would she refuse to leave, making this already tense moment spiral into something even worse? The situation hung in the balance, and the rest of the passengers watched in uneasy silence, unsure of what would unfold next. Malik sat still, heart pounding, his hands still gripping the seat as if it could anchor him to the ground. He couldn't help but wonder, was this the moment that would define his future? Would this experience of racism on his way to represent his school be something he could rise above, or would it leave a scar that would follow him throughout his life? The silence stretched on, heavy with anticipation, as the woman and the flight attendants locked eyes. Malik's mind raced with uncertainty. What would happen next? Would this moment of prejudice be allowed to stand, or would something greater be done to fight back? Was it time for the pilot to enforce his authority? Or would this moment of injustice slip away with no real consequence? As the seconds ticked by, Malik felt every ounce of tension in his body. The fate of this moment, of his journey, seemed to hang on the edge of a knife. What would he do next? Would he fight back, or would he stay quiet and hope the world around him would change? What will Malik do now? Will he rise above the injustice, or will this event be something that follows him forever? The questions lingered, unanswered, as the flight continued its course. What would you do in Malik's shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The woman still hadn't moved. Her hands rested firmly on her hips, her chin raised as if daring anyone, pilot, crew, or passenger, to challenge her authority. The air inside the first-class cabin of Flight 327 felt heavy, almost electric. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, whispering under their breath, while Malik Johnson sat motionless in his seat, trying to make himself smaller. He could still hear the echo of her words, "Get out of that seat, black boy." Even though the pilot's voice had come over the intercom, firm, commanding, cutting through the tension, it hadn't resolved anything yet. It had only magnified the scene. Everyone was waiting for someone to make the next move. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Ms. Harper, approached cautiously, her voice calm but steady. "Ma'am, please return to your assigned seat," she said. "The pilot has given a direct order." The woman scoffed. "The pilot doesn't know what he's talking about. This boy doesn't belong here." She jabbed a finger toward Malik again, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I paid for first class. I didn't pay to sit next to him." The words stung like fire, and Malik's stomach turned. He could feel every set of eyes in the cabin on him. Some sympathetic, some indifferent, some judgmental. He wanted to say something, but he didn't trust his voice not to shake. Instead, he took a deep breath and sat up straighter, gripping the armrests. His mother always told him, "Never let them see you break." He wasn't going to cry, not here, not now. He reminded himself why he was on this flight. Preston Academy. The school that had believed in him even when others didn't. The flight that the school had paid for was to reward his brilliance and hard work. He had earned this seat. He belonged here just as much as anyone else. But the woman wouldn't let it go. She leaned closer, her voice dripping with malice. "Do you even know how much this seat costs, huh? You people always want something for free." The words hit Malik like a punch to the gut. "You people." The venom in her tone made it clear what she meant. He clenched his jaw, his small chest rising and falling with each deep breath he took to hold back his anger. Ms. Harper raised her hand slightly. "Ma'am, please stop." But the woman wasn't done. "Stop? No, I'm not stopping until that boy is moved. I've traveled all my life, and never once have I seen." "Enough." Ms. Harper's voice cracked like thunder, startling everyone. "You will lower your voice right now, or I'll have security waiting when we land." The woman froze for a moment, her lips twitching in indignation. "I'll file a complaint. This is discrimination against me." That word, discrimination, hung in the air like a bad joke. Malik could almost laugh if it didn't hurt so much. The irony of hearing her use that word while humiliating him in front of an entire cabin was unbearable. He turned his head slightly toward the window, blinking hard. The clouds outside looked peaceful, nothing like the storm inside this plane. He could have stayed silent. But something inside him shifted. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, calm, and far more mature than anyone expected. "Ma'am," he said softly, "this seat was bought for me by my school. I'm representing them in a national competition in New York. I didn't take your seat. I earned mine." The entire cabin went quiet again. The woman's jaw tightened. Her lips trembled, but she didn't respond immediately. Malik's tone wasn't angry, it was composed, firm, and it disarmed her in a way that shouting never could. That calmness, that quiet dignity, seemed to unnerve her even more. "Well," she stammered, "you people always have some story, don't you?" The passengers around them began to murmur. One man, seated across the aisle, shook his head. "Ma'am, enough," he muttered under his breath. Another passenger, an older white woman, glanced at Malik, her eyes soft with sympathy. Ms. Harper stepped closer, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "You heard him. He earned his seat. And unless you want to be removed when we land, I suggest you take yours." The woman's face reddened, her nostrils flaring. She looked at Malik, then at the flight attendant, then toward the cockpit, as if hoping someone else would back her up. But no one did. The tension was suffocating. Every sound, the low hum of the engines, the click of a buckle, the shuffle of shoes, seemed amplified in the silence. Malik sat perfectly still, refusing to let her see fear. He didn't know it yet, but his quiet strength had begun to shift the power dynamic. The woman's authority, the confidence that came from years of unchecked privilege, was cracking. She turned toward Ms. Harper again, her voice rising, desperate to reclaim control. "I want to speak to the pilot. Right now. I have rights." Ms. Harper didn't move. "And the pilot has authority," she said calmly. "If you keep causing a disturbance, you won't be on this flight when we land." The woman hesitated. Her breathing grew heavy. For the first time, she seemed uncertain. Malik looked at her, his brown eyes steady. He didn't say another word, but the message was clear. "You can't take this from me." That unspoken defiance, the way he refused to break, infuriated her even more. "You think you're special, huh?" she snapped, leaning closer again. "You think one little ticket makes you equal?" Her words sliced through the air, cruel and bitter, but before Malik could respond, Ms. Harper raised her hand sharply. "That's enough, ma'am. One more word, and we'll have no choice but to contact security mid-flight." The woman froze, her lips pressed into a thin line. The silence stretched, tense and fragile, until she finally turned away and muttered something under her breath. But the damage was already done. Malik exhaled slowly, the tension still tightening his chest. The pilot's words earlier, "Remove her from my flight," still echoed in his mind. He didn't know if the crew would follow through or if they'd just try to contain the situation until landing. But he knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over. Somewhere deep down, he could sense it, the woman wasn't done. The anger in her eyes said as much. And Malik? He wasn't done either. What happens when quiet strength meets loud hate? Would the woman face consequences for what she'd done? Or would Malik's silence become his greatest weapon yet? "Tell me, if you were sitting in Malik's place, alone, targeted, yet determined, would you have stayed calm or stood up to her directly? Let's know what you would do." The woman's silence was temporary, dangerously so. Her jaw was tight, her knuckles white as she clutched the headrest in front of her. Every eye in the cabin remained fixed on her, but she refused to back down. Malik sat still, his gaze locked on the seat back ahead, trying to hold his composure. He wasn't just sitting in a chair anymore. He was sitting in a storm of prejudice, pride, and power that could explode at any second. Ms. Harper, the lead flight attendant, had already warned the woman twice. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you again to please return to your seat," she said, her tone calm but carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too many in-flight meltdowns. "The captain has spoken." The woman whipped around, glaring at Malik with a venomous sneer. "He's the one who should move. Look at him. He's just a kid. First class isn't for charity cases." Her voice carried across the cabin, sharp and ugly. A few passengers murmured disapproval, and others sank lower into their seats, afraid to get involved. But Malik didn't move. He didn't even blink. His mother's words echoed in his head, "Always carry yourself like you belong in every room you walk into." He did belong here. He earned the seat. And now, it was time for the woman learn that. Before anyone could respond, Ms. Harper's intercom crackled again. The pilot's deep voice filled the air, his tone sharper this time. "Ms. Harper, is the issue resolved?" She hesitated, glancing toward the defiant woman. "Not yet, Captain," she replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. The woman scoffed. "Oh, for heaven's sake, it's a misunderstanding. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." Malik turned his head slightly, his voice quiet but clear. "I don't think everyone's thinking that," he said. The woman's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "I said," Malik repeated, still calm, "I don't think everyone agrees with you." His voice trembled slightly, but there was something powerful beneath it, resolve. For a moment, the cabin was silent. Then, somewhere behind them, a man's voice broke the stillness. "He's right," the passenger said firmly. "You're out of line, lady." The woman turned, shocked. Another passenger chimed in. "Let the boy sit in peace. You're embarrassing yourself." The tide was turning. The murmurs grew louder, the passengers emboldened now that someone had spoken up. Malik's quiet strength had shifted the room, and the woman could feel it slipping from her grasp. Her face flushed red, her words caught between anger and panic. She turned toward Ms. Harper again, desperate. "You're going to regret this. I have friends in high places. I'll make sure this airline hears about it." "Then you can tell them yourself," Ms. Harper said curtly. "Because the captain has requested to speak with you personally." There was a murmur of surprise across the cabin. Even Malik looked up, startled. Ms. Harper leaned forward and whispered something into her earpiece before turning to the woman. "He's coming out now." The passengers exchanged confused looks. The pilot was coming out? That rarely happened mid-flight. Seconds later, the cockpit door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out in uniform. His presence immediately commanded attention. His name tag read Captain Daniel Rhodes. His eyes were cool and steady as he walked down the aisle toward the commotion. The woman's expression shifted instantly, from fury to forced politeness. "Captain," she began, trying to sound composed, "I was just explaining." He raised a hand to stop her. "Ma'am, I don't need an explanation. I heard everything." The woman blinked. "You heard everything?" "Yes," he said evenly. "Every word." She straightened her posture, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just concerned that a child was sitting in first class?" Captain Rhodes finished for her, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the entire cabin. "A child who paid for his ticket, like every other passenger here?" The woman froze. "Do you know who this young man is?" the captain continued, his tone calm but razor-sharp. "Because I do." Malik blinked, confused. He didn't know the pilot personally. How could he? The captain turned toward him and gave a small nod. "Malik Johnson," he said with a faint smile. "National finalist in the Future Innovators of America Challenge. Your school contacted the airline earlier this week to ensure you'd have a comfortable flight. We were proud to have you on board." A wave of whispers spread through the cabin. Malik's eyes widened. He hadn't expected that. He'd been told the school had arranged everything, but not that the airline knew his name or his achievements. The woman's face went pale. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean." Captain Rhodes cut her off sharply. "You didn't care to know," he said. "That's the problem." The weight of his words hit like a thunderclap. The passengers who'd stayed silent earlier now looked at the woman with visible disgust. She tried to speak again, but her words came out in broken stammers. Captain Rhodes crouched slightly beside Malik's seat. "You all right, son?" Malik nodded, his voice soft. "Yes, sir." "You handled yourself better than most adults would," the captain said, his voice kind but firm. "Your mother raised a strong young man." Malik swallowed hard, emotion rising in his throat. "Thank you, sir." Captain Rhodes stood, his eyes locking on the woman again. "Ma'am, you've disrupted my flight, insulted my crew, and humiliated a passenger who did absolutely nothing wrong. You will either sit quietly for the remainder of this flight, or you'll be met by airport security when we land." The woman opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no arrogance left in her voice now, only embarrassment. "I'll sit," she whispered. "Good," the captain said, then added firmly, "and while you're sitting, you might think about the lesson you've just learned from a 13-year-old boy who showed more class than you did." The words hung heavy in the air as the captain turned and walked back toward the cockpit. The cabin erupted into quiet applause, soft, hesitant at first, but growing louder. Ms. Harper smiled faintly as she passed Malik a small cup of juice. "You did well, sweetheart," she whispered. Malik's cheeks burned, but this time, it wasn't from shame. It was pride. He had stayed calm. He had held his ground. And now, the entire cabin knew it. But as the applause faded and the passengers settled back into their seats, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The woman sat stiffly 2 rows ahead, her shoulders tense, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. She wasn't finished, not yet. Was she planning something? A complaint? The revenge call? Malik didn't know. But he could sense it, the air of unfinished business. The flight continued, but beneath the calm hum of the engines, tension still simmered. What happens when someone who's used to power realizes they've lost it? Would the woman let it go, or try to take back control in ways no one expected? If you were in Malik's place, watching her just a few seats away, what would you do? Stay quiet and let karma take its course, or keep your guard up, ready for whatever comes next? The woman sat stiffly in her seat, her knuckles clenched around her phone as though it were her only lifeline. The seconds ticked by, and the quiet hum of the engines seemed to grow louder in the tense silence. Malik couldn't help but notice her every move, her narrowed eyes, the way she gripped the armrest as if she were preparing to launch herself out of the seat at any moment. Despite her defeat, the storm inside her was far from over. She had been publicly humiliated, her privileges ripped away in front of a cabin full of strangers. And she wasn't ready to let it go. Malik, on the other hand, had settled back into his seat. The applause had faded, and the other passengers had gone back to their routines. Some whispered congratulations, others turned their attention to their phones or books. But Malik was hyper-aware of every movement around him. His mind was still racing. His heart had barely slowed since the moment he'd been called out, the sting of the woman's words still lingering. Yet, despite everything, he had maintained his composure. It was what his mother would have wanted, what his teachers had always told him to do. He had to remain calm. This wasn't about the woman, this was about his future. But the woman was a different story. Her lips twitched, and her face reddened with simmering rage. It was clear she was fighting the urge to lash out, struggling to maintain any semblance of control. She clenched her jaw, her eyes darting from the window to the aisle, then back to Malik. Her fingers tapped impatiently against the armrest, and her entire body radiated tension. This was far from over. Minutes passed in a suffocating quiet, but the atmosphere in the cabin grew thicker. The passengers were divided, some stealing glances at Malik, others uncomfortable with the scene that had unfolded. Some whispered to each other, still talking about the confrontation. A few passengers sent sympathetic smiles Malik's way, while others avoided eye contact altogether. But no one said anything. And then, just as the flight attendants began to move down the aisle again, the woman snapped. "Why don't you just leave the boy alone and move?" she suddenly spat out, her voice like broken glass. The flight attendants stopped in their tracks. "Ma'am, we've asked you to settle down. If you continue this behavior, we will be forced to report it to authorities upon landing," one of them said, but her voice was less certain now, unsure whether the woman would relent. "I will not be treated like this," the woman hissed, her eyes wild with frustration. She stood up abruptly, her actions jerky and uncoordinated, and she glared at Malik as though trying to burn him with her stare. A passenger seated behind her, an older man with graying hair, turned to her with a sharp glance. "What are you going to do, lady? Embarrass yourself further?" The woman's face twisted. She opened her mouth to respond, but found herself lost for words. Malik's eyes flicked toward her briefly, a flash of defiance running through his chest. He wasn't going to break. "Sit down," a calm voice broke the tension. It was the voice of Captain Rhodes again, now back in the cabin. He had reappeared from the cockpit, his feet planted firmly on the ground as he approached the woman. "Ma'am," the captain's voice rang out with authority, "you will stop right now. You are disturbing the peace of this flight, and I've already asked you to leave the boy alone. If you refuse, I will have no choice but to contact security and have you removed." His tone was like steel, yet calm. But the woman's desperation and pride were too strong. The words came pouring out of her in a rush, her voice increasingly shrill. "You don't understand. You can't let him. He doesn't even deserve this seat." The passengers around her stiffened, exchanging glances as she completely lost control. The same passengers who had initially avoided conflict now began murmuring, some exchanging knowing glances, some rolling their eyes. "You're embarrassing yourself," another passenger from the back of the cabin called out, his voice sarcastic but pointed. "Give it a rest. No one cares what you think." The woman froze, her face flushing a deeper shade of crimson. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, a low hum of disapproval rippling through the passengers as they collectively sided with Malik. Her moment of privilege, her moment of power, was slipping. Every word she spoke now seemed to dig her deeper into a pit of isolation. Malik watched the transformation carefully, his heart racing with each second. He knew what was happening. He wasn't just witnessing a moment of racial injustice anymore. He was witnessing someone who had always held the upper hand finally realize that her grip on power was slipping away. But she wasn't done yet. "Do you think you've won?" the woman hissed, her voice dangerously low. Her eyes flicked to Malik, then back to the captain. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, her fingers trembling. "I'll make sure this airline never lets a child like him sit in first class again. I will make your lives hell." Her words were a declaration of war, a threat to burn everything down because she could no longer control the situation. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was desperate to regain some shred of power, to turn the tables back in her favor. And Malik knew, deep down, that the confrontation wasn't over. The passengers, who had witnessed the unfolding drama, were now visibly uncomfortable. Several passengers had their phones out, recording. The situation had escalated into a spectacle, an uncomfortable, palpable tension that made everyone on board feel like they were in the midst of a live-wire standoff. It was no longer just about Malik and the woman. It was about how society views power, race, and entitlement. Everyone was watching. "You're not going to do anything," Captain Rhodes said softly, but there was no mistaking the steel in his voice. "I've heard enough. This will not continue." But the woman wasn't finished yet. She stood up fully now, her fists clenched at her sides. She took a step toward the aisle, eyes blazing. "Try me," she spat. In that moment, the cabin was on the brink of chaos. The passengers leaned in, their attention caught. It was clear that the woman was at her breaking point. Every muscle in her body seemed coiled to strike. Whether verbally or physically, it didn't matter. The power was about to shift completely. Would the woman finally be escorted off the plane? Or would she escalate this moment into something even worse, pushing the situation past the point of no return? Malik could feel the weight of what was happening. The woman was out of control, but he had a choice to make. Would he continue to stand his ground, silently claiming his space and dignity? Or would he react, pushing the boundaries and demanding a voice in a situation that number 13-year-old should ever have to face? Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. Malik's breath was shallow, his fingers tightly gripping the armrest. The power to change this moment, whether through silence or strength, was in his hands. What happens when a person refuses to back down in the face of relentless adversity? Would the woman's actions cross a line that would finally force the airline to take drastic action? What would you do in Malik's place? Stand quietly and let the power shift, or push back even further, knowing the consequences? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The cabin was filled with an almost unbearable tension. The woman stood in the aisle, her body trembling with barely contained rage, her face flushed with humiliation. Every eye in the cabin was on her now, waiting to see what she would do next. The flight attendants were stiff, their hands held at their sides as if bracing for something to snap. Captain Rhodes, who had stood tall and resolute only moments earlier, was now staring at the woman, his expression unreadable. Malik remained still in his seat, his breathing slow but steady. Despite the confrontation, despite the words that had been thrown at him like weapons, he held his ground. He knew that this moment wasn't just about him. It was a battle between dignity and hatred. And as much as the woman seemed determined to win, Malik wasn't going to let her. She turned her gaze to him again, her eyes narrowed with contempt. "You think this is over?" she spat, her voice low, seething with fury. "This isn't over, black boy." Malik's heart thudded in his chest, but his expression didn't change. He didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. He had learned from his mother that the power of silence and calm could sometimes be more devastating than any words or actions. He'd been quiet so far, refusing to let her words affect him, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing him react. But the woman wasn't finished. She was angry now, not just at Malik, but at the entire situation. "You don't know who I am," she hissed, her voice frantic. "I can have you thrown off this flight. I have connections." She was unraveling and everyone could see it. Her once commanding posture had started to crumble. Her voice, full of hatred and entitlement, was becoming desperate. Captain Rhodes remained unmoved, his eyes fixed on the woman. "I've heard enough," he said, his voice calm, but there was a weight behind it that made every word count. I gave you a chance to resolve this with dignity. Now, you're disturbing the peace on this flight, and I will not tolerate that. You are threatening a passenger who has done nothing wrong. The woman's hands trembled, her lips pressing into a thin line, but she still refused to back down. He doesn't belong here. He doesn't belong in first class. I belong here. I paid for my seat and I— You paid for a ticket, Captain Rhodes interrupted, his voice sharp now. And so did he. He earned his seat just like you did. Your privilege does not give you the right to treat anyone like less than a human being. Malik, still sitting quietly, now felt the eyes of every passenger on him. Some stared at him with sympathy, others with discomfort. It was as if the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. And as the woman continued to shout, her voice cracking with the weight of her own insecurity, Malik felt a shift in the air, an almost imperceptible shift, but one that had been building since the moment she had first targeted him. The flight attendants, still standing near her, exchanged silent glances, their patience wearing thin. The woman was no longer in control. She thought she had the power, but it was slipping away with each moment. And as her fury built, so did the resolve of those who had remained silent, unsure of how to intervene. The cabin was becoming a battleground, but this time, the woman wasn't the one with the upper hand. Then, just as sensing the change in the air, Captain Rhodes, the pilot, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward once again. His voice broke the tension, calm and deliberate, yet full of authority. "Ma'am," he began, his tone calm but firm. "What if this child were your son?" The woman's body stiffened, her voice halting. What do you mean?" Captain Rhodes stepped closer, unwavering in his gaze. "I'm asking you," he said, his voice steady. "What if this were your son, sitting in that seat? Would you still say the same thing? Would you still treat him like this?" The woman, caught off guard, stumbled back slightly, trying to find the words to dismiss the question. She blinked rapidly, her face contorting as if she didn't understand what was being asked of her. "I don't," she muttered, her voice faltering. "This isn't about me, it's about him." Her eyes flicked toward Malik again with disdain. Captain Rhodes didn't let up. "What if Malik were your son?" he repeated, his voice unwavering. "Would you still make him feel less than human? Would you still think of him as something you couldn't have?" The woman's breath hitched as if the weight of the question had suddenly become too much to bear. "I'm white. I'm not," she stammered, but the words were becoming harder to find. "I don't want a child like him." The cold, cutting realization seemed to land harder than her words. Malik, who had remained silent up until now, could feel the anger rising inside him, but he knew that this wasn't the time to show it. He was calm, but he felt a deep sense of pride. Captain Rhodes had just turned the tables on her, using her own ignorance and arrogance against her. "I see," Captain Rhodes said, his voice still even but now tinged with disappointment. "You can't have a child like him. Not because of who he is, but because of who you think you are." The woman opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence in the cabin was deafening as the passengers around them seemed to inhale in unison, their eyes wide. It was as though the room had collectively recognized the weight of what had just been exposed, her racism, her entitlement, and her complete inability to see Malik for the person he truly was. Captain Rhodes stood tall. "Malik has earned his place here, in this seat, in this world. And you?" He let the question hang in the air. "You've proven just how little you understand about true dignity. It doesn't come from the color of your skin or your privilege. It comes from how you treat others." The woman was now completely silent, her face drained of color, her body slumped as she returned to her seat, utterly defeated. She stared down at her hands, which still gripped the armrest as if her life depended on it. The pride she once held was gone, replaced by the stark realization that she had just been exposed for who she truly was. Malik's chest tightened with relief, but there was no celebration in the moment. There was only quiet, steadfast strength, the kind that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, regardless of the outcome. Captain Rhodes turned away from her, addressing the rest of the cabin now. "This is a lesson for all of us," he said, his voice strong. "Racism has no place on this flight. and it will have no place in any of our lives. A moment of quiet applause began at the back of the cabin, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder as the passengers began to realize the gravity of what had just unfolded. The flight attendants gave subtle nods of approval, and Malik couldn't help but feel the tiniest sense of pride. But even as the applause continued, a new tension settled in the air. The woman's humiliation wasn't over. Would she accept this defeat, or would she try to strike back once they landed? Would this moment be forgotten, or would it continue to haunt her long after the flight was over? Malik's mind raced. The cabin was quiet again, but this wasn't the end. Not for him, not for her. Would the woman try to escalate things when they landed? Would she make a scene at the airport, seeking retribution for her shattered pride? Or was she finally broken, defeated by the calm dignity of a 13-year-old boy? The questions lingered, unanswered, as the plane continued its descent toward New York. And Malik? He remained poised, ready for whatever came next. What would you do in Malik's position? Would you stay calm and carry on, knowing the truth was on your side? Or would you be tempted to fight back against the cruelty in the world? The tension in the cabin didn't dissipate immediately. The woman, now slumped in her seat, seemed to shrink under the weight of her own humiliation. Her shoulders were hunched, her face pale, her hands still trembling in her lap. Every inch of her body screamed defeat, but she refused to acknowledge it. She stared out of the window, her eyes glazed, as if hoping the world would somehow rewind and let her take back the venomous words she had thrown at Malik. The passengers, however, could not forget. A few exchanged whispered comments, their voices low but filled with disbelief at the cruelty they had just witnessed. Some offered Malik a glance of quiet respect, while others turned away, uncomfortable with the drama that had unfolded in front of them. But Malik, ever the composed young man, held his head high. He had done nothing wrong. He had not reacted with anger, nor had he retaliated with hatred. He had remained calm and dignified, and that was enough. It was his victory, not just in this moment, but for everyone who would come after him. Captain Rhodes stepped away from the woman's seat, nodding to the flight attendants who had been quiet observers. He spoke into his earpiece, requesting assistance upon landing. The woman, her fury still simmering beneath the surface, sat in silence, waiting for what would come next. Malik knew that this wasn't over. Not yet. He had won the confrontation, but the question remained. What would the woman do now? Would she try to make life difficult for him at the airport? Would she try to ruin the reputation of the airline? Or would she slink away, defeated by the truth of her own actions? The flight continued its descent into New York, the engines humming steadily as the city loomed closer below. But Malik couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something told him that the woman wouldn't simply let this go. She had made a scene, and in her mind, that meant she hadn't lost, at least not completely. She would want retribution. As the plane landed and taxied toward the gate, the cabin crew began their final preparations. Malik gathered his belongings, his mind still racing with thoughts of what had just transpired. He had faced prejudice head-on, and he had emerged stronger. But the question still lingered. Would the woman escalate this situation? Would she take her racism to the next level? Or would she slink off into the terminal, defeated and ashamed? The moment the plane came to a stop, the crew swiftly moved into action. Passengers began standing up, collecting their bags, but Malik could sense the eyes on him, the lingering stares from some, the glances from others, all filled with unspoken questions. And then, just as Malik stood to exit the plane, the flight attendants were at the woman's seat, speaking quietly to her. The woman's face twisted in frustration, but she didn't resist. She stood up slowly, the humiliation now completely evident on her face. "We're going to have to ask you to stay behind, ma'am," one of the flight attendants said gently. "The captain has requested that we have you escorted to the gate by security." Malik's heart raced as he realized what was happening. The captain wasn't letting this slide. She wasn't just being removed from the first-class cabin. She was about to face real consequences for her actions. "Excuse me," the woman scoffed, her voice trembling. "This is ridiculous. I paid for my seat. I'll speak to your manager." But her voice was no longer full of power. It was a desperate cry, a last-ditch attempt to hold on to the last shred of control she had left. "You've already spoken, ma'am," the flight attendant replied, her tone unwavering. "Now it's time for us to speak." As the woman was escorted off the plane by security, the rest of the passengers slowly filed out. Some didn't even glance her way, but others couldn't help but watch as she was guided toward the gate, her head held low, her body stiff with anger. Malik, standing in the aisle, finally felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had faced the worst of it, but now the woman would face the consequences. He stepped off the plane and into the airport terminal, his steps light, but his heart still racing. His mind flashed back to the moment he had been singled out, when he had been humiliated, targeted, for no reason other than the color of his skin. He had thought the worst part was over, but now, as he watched the woman walk away, escorted by security, it became clear that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about justice. Security had already begun speaking to the woman at the gate, and she was becoming more agitated, her words becoming a blur of threats and accusations. Malik couldn't help but watch from a distance. His stomach churned, but this time, it wasn't with fear or uncertainty. This time, he was watching the woman who had tried to strip him of his dignity now lose her own. Minutes later, a manager from the airline approached him, her demeanor respectful, but with a touch of wariness. She introduced herself as Diana Clark, the gate manager, and after a brief conversation, she apologized on behalf of the airline. "I want you to know that we take this matter seriously," she said. "We'll be conducting a full review of this incident. The woman will not be allowed to fly with us again, and we will ensure that this situation is addressed appropriately." Malik nodded, still processing the gravity of the situation. His mind was focused on something bigger now. Something deeper. It wasn't just about this flight anymore. It was about setting a precedent. It was about standing up to the kind of ignorance that would make someone believe they were superior simply because of the color of their skin. He had made a difference today. But there was one last thing the manager had to say. "We're also offering you compensation for the inconvenience," she said, handing him a voucher. "But honestly, that's the least we can do. What you did, how you handled yourself in that situation, was remarkable. It's something we'll be sharing with our team." Malik smiled, though he didn't feel the need to take the voucher. The recognition felt like enough. He hadn't acted for compensation. He hadn't even acted for vindication. He had acted because it was the right thing to do. He had stood firm in the face of adversity, and now, justice had been served. As Malik made his way toward the competition hall, ready to represent Preston Academy, he knew he had done more than just earn his place. He had shown the world that no matter how many obstacles stood in his way, he would always rise. But even as Malik walked away from the airport, he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's story wasn't over. Would she continue to cause trouble? Would she attempt to retaliate? He would be ready. This moment had shown him something important. Strength wasn't just about winning in the moment. It was about holding your ground, no matter what came next. Would the woman try to escalate things further? Or was her defeat final? What would you do if you were in Malik's shoes? How would you handle a confrontation like that? Would you stay calm or fight back? Let us know in the comments below. As Malik made his way through the bustling terminal, his steps felt heavier than they had before. The tension from the flight still lingered in the air, though it was no longer the sharp, stifling kind. Now, it was more of a slow realization settling in, an understanding that this wasn't just a fleeting moment in time, it was a defining experience that would stay with him forever. The echoes of the confrontation, the words exchanged, and the woman's defeat had left an imprint on his soul. It was more than just about the flight. It was about a fight for dignity, for the right to simply be. He couldn't help but think about the woman, how quickly her confidence had shattered when faced with the truth. She had tried to reduce him to nothing but the color of his skin, but in the end, it was her own prejudice that exposed her for who she truly was. Her fight was with herself, Malik thought. Her hate was the only thing holding her back. As he passed through the terminal, Malik felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. But there was also something else, something lighter, something more freeing. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, "You are just as worthy as anyone, and no one can take that from you." He had stood tall, calm, and unwavering in the face of racism. He had refused to let anyone define his worth, and in doing so, he had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. He had proven that quiet strength could overpower the loudest hate. The competition loomed ahead, the culmination of years of hard work and dedication, but it didn't feel like the most important thing in that moment. In a way, it felt secondary. He had already won. He had already made a difference. He had shown everyone who had been watching that racism, no matter how subtle or overt, would not go unchecked. His actions, his composure, and his resolve had made that clear. As he stood in line, waiting to check in for the competition, he looked around at the other travelers, some of them busy with their phones, some lost in conversation, others staring blankly ahead. It was easy to forget that in the midst of their everyday lives, there were moments of injustice happening all around them, just as he had experienced on that plane. The truth was, most people didn't want to confront it. Most people didn't want to get involved. But that moment had shown him something crucial. Every silence is a choice. When faced with injustice, to remain silent is to enable it. To speak out, to act, to stand firm. Those were the choices that created change. As Malik checked in for the competition, his thoughts shifted back to the flight. His body still hummed with the adrenaline of that confrontation, but now, it felt different. It wasn't anger or frustration that fueled him, it was purpose. This is why I'm here, he realized. Not just to represent my school, but to represent something greater. His thoughts returned to the flight, to the way Sarah, the flight attendant, had stood beside him, and to Captain Rhodes' unwavering support. He thought about how the crew had acted, how they had shown that racism would not be tolerated in their space. Malik had always believed in standing up for what was right, but that moment on the plane had given him a glimpse of what true collective strength looked like, how a community, however small, could band together and say no to hate. It wasn't just about one person standing up, it was about all of them standing together. Malik couldn't shake the image of the woman's face as she was escorted from the plane, defeated. It had been the first time he had seen someone so certain of their superiority crumble so quickly. The shame, the fear, the realization that her entitlement had no place in a world where people like Malik were willing to stand up for themselves, it had all been visible in her eyes. The thought of that moment gave him a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had done what needed to be done. But the question still lingered, what now? He knew this was only the beginning. The woman might have been removed from the plane, but her kind of thinking still existed in the world. People like her, who believed that their status, their race, their privilege made them better than others, they were still out there. And they would continue to try to push others down, to belittle them. But Malik now knew that every time someone stood up against it, the walls of hate crumbled just a little bit more. Malik's mind drifted back to his mother's words. You are just as worthy as anyone. He could hear them clearly now. The weight of that statement had never been more real. He had been tested, had been pushed to the edge of his limits, and in that moment, he had risen to the occasion. What if his story had ended differently? He wondered. What if he had stayed silent? What if he had backed down? But he didn't. He had stood firm, and in doing so, he had given the world a glimpse of the strength that could be found in standing up for what is right. It was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The belief that no matter how many times racism reared its ugly head, he had the power to fight back. And so did everyone else. Now, as he stood at the competition check-in, a sense of calm settled over him. The nervousness he had felt earlier had dissipated. He was here for one reason, to show the world what he was capable of. To show them that it didn't matter where you came from or what others thought of you. What mattered was who you were inside, and how you carried that with you into the world. As the attendant handed him his credentials, Malik felt a rush of pride. I'm ready, he thought. Not just for this competition, but for everything that comes next. He looked back toward the gate where the woman had been escorted off, but she was long gone. He didn't know what would happen to her, but he knew one thing for sure, she would never forget the boy she tried to belittle. And in a world that still struggles with racial inequality, that was a victory. Malik walked toward the competition hall, his steps confident, his heart steady, ready to face whatever the future held. He had learned a powerful lesson that day. the fight for justice is never over, but it always starts with one voice. As he walked through the doors of the competition hall, he could feel the weight of his own victory. It wasn't about winning this competition, it was about standing up, being bold, and never letting anyone tell him he didn't belong. What would you do if you were Malik? How would you handle a situation where your worth was questioned simply because of the color of your skin? The aftermath of the flight was as heavy as the storm that had just passed. Malik had arrived at the competition and participated with unwavering focus, but the shadow of what had transpired lingered in his mind. As the day wore on and he moved through the competition, his mind kept drifting back to the woman on the plane, the words she'd thrown at him, the blatant racism, and the way she had tried to strip him of his dignity. But now, something had shifted inside Malik. He wasn't just here to compete for a title, he was here to continue a fight that had begun much earlier. A fight for equality, a fight against discrimination, and most importantly, a fight to prove that his voice, his brilliance, his worth, could never be diminished. However, that fight was bigger than just this competition. It was bigger than this flight. It was about something deeper, a fight for justice that Malik knew he could never walk away from. What happened on that plane had shaken something loose in the air. It wasn't just the confrontation. It wasn't just the public humiliation of the woman. It was the ripple effect that would surely follow. The anger she had tried to sow would now be met with something far stronger, awareness. Back in the terminal, the airline had taken swift action. The woman's name had already been reported to higher-ups by Captain Rhodes and flight attendants. The company, after conducting a thorough review of the situation, had decided to take immediate steps to ensure that such an incident would never happen again. They had gone through the woman's history with the airline, checking her past flights, complaints, and her interactions with other staff members. It wasn't long before the woman's behavior was tied to a series of similar complaints about inappropriate conduct. She was known for being demanding, disrespectful, and entitled, a woman who assumed her status could shield her from consequences. Malik never saw it coming, but it seemed that the universe had a way of bringing justice to those who thought they were untouchable. The woman was terminated from her position in the company, and her long-standing privilege was stripped from her like a veil, leaving her exposed for the world to see. She had been the one to humiliate Malik, but it was her own actions that led to her downfall. The company issued a formal apology to Malik, but what struck him most was how they communicated the consequences of her behavior. Her job was gone. Her reputation was shattered. She had been a source of pride within her privileged circles, but now she was publicly exposed for the very racism that she thought she could wield without consequence. The shame and disgrace she faced were enough to make her retreat into obscurity. As news of the incident spread, the wider community began to take notice. Passengers who had been on that flight spoke out, sharing their stories of what they had witnessed. Some praised Malik for his calm, his bravery, and his unwavering resolve. Others spoke out about their own experiences with racism, some echoing the same sentiments the woman had expressed. But the real impact, Malik realized, was that the story was sparking conversations. People were discussing the incident, discussing what it meant to stand up for justice, to fight back against racial discrimination, to not let people like that woman control the narrative. It was forcing people to ask themselves uncomfortable questions about their own behavior, about the way they might have silently allowed injustice to thrive around them. Malik's story went viral. Social media platforms buzzed with discussions about his poise and strength. Hashtags like Stand With Malik and Fight Racism trended across the internet, with people sharing their own experiences and pledging to make a difference. It was no longer just his fight. It was now a global conversation. The airline company's decision to take swift action, coupled with the public's outpouring of support for Malik, sent a strong message: racism would not be tolerated. But the story didn't just impact the woman or the company, it affected everyone on that flight. The other passengers who had witnessed the moment came forward, some offering their apologies for not stepping in sooner, others reflecting on how they had failed to speak up against the woman's behavior. The flight attendants, too, became heroes in the eyes of many. Sarah, the flight attendant who had spoken up so boldly, received commendations and recognition for her courage. She had not just served her role as an attendant, she had taken on the responsibility of being an ally. Her action to defend Malik was a powerful reminder to everyone that standing up against injustice requires more than just the courage to speak. It requires the willingness to challenge people, even when it's uncomfortable. In a world where silence is often mistaken for compliance, Sarah's action was a call for others to act. People began to realize that it wasn't enough to be neutral in the face of injustice. It was time to take a stand. As for Malik, his victory didn't come with a medal or a trophy. It came with something far more significant. It came with the knowledge that his actions had ripple effects that would be felt long after this day. He wasn't just competing for a title, he was creating a movement. But the consequences of the woman's actions, and the public outcry, weren't the only things that shook Malik's world. The lesson he had learned on that plane stayed with him. How a simple act of standing firm, refusing to be silenced, could transform a situation. The fight for justice wasn't something that could be done in isolation. It was a fight that required community, allies, and courage. Malik had found all of that, and it had given him a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that his battle wasn't over. Racism, inequality, and injustice were still deeply rooted in society, and they couldn't be dismantled with one incident. But this moment had proven something crucial. Change starts with action. Malik's action had led to a shift, no matter how small, and that shift had been enough to inspire others to act as well. As Malik stepped off the stage of the competition, his heart pounding with excitement from the challenges he had faced and overcome, he knew this was only the beginning. His voice, his experiences, and his actions were already making a difference. But the questions that lingered in the air remained. Would people continue to stand up in the face of racism? Would the woman ever truly learn from her actions? And how far could Malik's voice reach in the fight for justice? He had started a conversation that couldn't be silenced. His journey was just beginning. Now the question goes to you. How far would you go to stand up against racial discrimination in your life? What would you do if you were in Malik's shoes? As Malik stood there, the applause still echoing in his ears, a wave of reflection washed over him. The spotlight on him had faded, but his thoughts were clearer than ever. This wasn't just about winning a competition or earning recognition. It was about something deeper, more meaningful. He had used his platform, his voice, and his experiences to highlight a truth that needed to be heard. His mind flashed back to the moment when he stood before the judges, his words sharp and filled with conviction. He had shared his story of racial discrimination, the flight that had challenged him, and the lessons that had emerged from it. That moment of truth had become a powerful message. A lesson not just for the judges, but for the audience, for the world watching. Malik had stood tall, unwavering in his commitment to justice. As the applause died down, Malik caught the eye of a few people in the crowd. Parents were nodding in approval, teachers with looks of pride, and even strangers who had been touched by his words. It was clear that this wasn't just about his brilliance in science or math. It was about his strength, his resolve in the face of adversity, and his ability to turn a painful experience into a platform for change. The competition had been about showcasing his intellect, but it had also become an opportunity to address something that affected everyone: racism. He had used his moment to remind others that speaking out was just as important as excelling academically. And yet, even as he stood there, basking in the success of his speech and the lessons it imparted, Malik knew this was far from over. The story of that woman on the plane, her prejudices and her arrogance, would resonate far beyond that single encounter. Malik's victory wasn't just personal, it was a call to action, an example for others to see that standing up against hate, injustice, and discrimination mattered. In the midst of all this reflection, Malik also thought about the people who had been his allies in that fight. His thoughts immediately turned to the flight crew, especially Captain Rhodes and Ms. Sarah. Captain Rhodes, with his calm but firm authority, had been the one to intervene at just the right moment. His decision to remove the woman from the plane wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about taking a stand for what was right. Malik would never forget the way Captain Rhodes had backed him up, not just as a passenger, but as a person. Miss Sarah, too, had been a hero in his eyes. She had not been content to let the woman continue her tirade. Her bold question, "What if this child were your son?" had been the turning point, the moment when the woman realized that her prejudice was no longer going to be tolerated. Sarah had not just spoken up, she had used her voice to create change, to force others to look at their behavior. Malik felt a deep sense of gratitude toward her, knowing that without her intervention, the situation might have spiraled even further. As he stood at the front of the competition hall, he praised them both in his speech. "I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the support I received from people like Captain Rhodes and Miss Sarah," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "They didn't just do their jobs, they stood with me when it mattered. They showed me that there are people in this world who won't turn away when injustice happens. They taught me that change happens when we take a stand together." The room erupted in applause once again. This time, it wasn't just for Malik, but for the people who had helped him find his voice. The journey Malik had gone on wasn't just a personal one. It mirrored the struggles of many who fought daily against racial discrimination. His ability to maintain composure, to stand tall in the face of hate, spoke to the quiet strength that so many people of color had to carry with them throughout their lives. What Malik showed, though, was that this strength, while vital, was not enough on its own. Change requires more than just endurance. It requires action. It requires voices. And sometimes, it requires standing alone. Malik had not just endured. He had spoken out, he had acted, and that was where true change began. The woman on the plane had underestimated the power of a young black boy who refused to be pushed down. She had underestimated the power of calm, dignity, and courage. But it was more than just that moment of confrontation. It was the ripple effect that had come from it. The passengers who had witnessed the event, the flight attendants who had intervened, the social media posts that went viral afterward. It was the realization that every voice matters, no matter how young or small. Malik had learned that standing up for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. The fight for racial equality was ongoing, and the only way to overcome it was by continuing to speak up, continuing to challenge injustice, and continuing to show the world that racism had no place in it. This story doesn't end with Malik. It continues with all of us. Malik's strength was the strength of everyone who stands up to hate, who faces prejudice and refuses to let it define them. But there are more battles to fight, more voices to be heard. What would you do if you were in Malik's shoes? Would you stand firm, or would you stay silent? Let us know in the comments below. Your voice matters. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Hyper Racism channel, because we can't stop fighting for equality until every person is seen for who they truly are, not the color of their skin.